One thing that always lingered over me when I first made this channel was a sense of imposter syndrome. I always wanted to balance the arguments I made with the beliefs held by the academic community, because, who am I to make up my own terms, classifications, or labels? But then I read that part in Plato's Republic where he advocates for women to wrestle naked in the park. And after that, somewhere in between Voltaire writing about an old lady getting gangbanged by African pirates and postmodernists claiming that the archaeological community is wrong about a pharaoh dying of tuberculosis because it had not yet been invented as a social construct, I kinda had the realization that the academic community, if there ever was such a singular and monolithic thing, is not immune from scrutiny. And besides, it's not like the end of the world if I make a YouTube video saying, here are some terms I agree with, here are some concepts that I have not yet heard discussed, and here are some criticisms I have of the current terminology. So today I want to start a discussion on what I can only describe as the directions and types of thought, providing my own terminology, and especially in this video, challenging some terms that I don't think are all too productive to discourse in the modern age. For example, when it comes to the conversation of how knowledge is acquired, the discussion becomes that of empiricism versus rationalism, which is essentially to say experience versus intuition. On the extreme end of empiricism, you have people who are dismissive of a priori knowledge, which is knowledge gained without experience. For example, a statement like all bachelors are single is not something that needs to be observed in order to be learned. It can be reasoned out. The opposite of this is a posteriori knowledge, which is learned through experience. On the extreme of rationalism, you could reject this kind of knowledge. But generally, rationalism is just the belief that reason has supremacy over experience. Or in other words, it is the view that regards reason as the chief source and test of knowledge, and that a class of truth exists that the intellect can grasp directly. And empiricism is the belief that experience has supremacy over reason, or the view that all concepts originate in experience, that all concepts are about or applicable to things that can be experienced, or that all rationally acceptable beliefs or propositions are justifiable or knowable only through experience. And with this distinction, most people fall somewhere in between these two camps, which is actually the core of my criticism with this distinction. Obviously, it's usually a good test of two extremes when they create a meaningful spectrum like the one we see here. So that's not what I mean. Instead, take for example Descartes' I think therefore I am. This is generally held as the pinnacle of rationalism. The idea essentially being that the existence of the self can be proven by virtue of the fact that the self is aware of, itself. But in this, aren't we saying that the proof is a matter of observation? Without the introspection of examining one's own thoughts, would we not know that we exist? And so since it is through this observation, doesn't that prove that this foundation of rationalist thought and foundations like it actually find their footing in observation, affirming experience's supremacy over reason? Well, I think it's fair to say that the line between reason and experience can be fairly blurred at times, but I imagine that a rationalist could respond like this. Yes, we observe our own existence, but that is not what drives the proof. We can also observe other things, like other people and physical objects. But if we are willing to humor existentialist and solipsist arguments, the observation of these things alone does not prove their existence. External objects could be figments of our imagination, or you could be a brain in a jar where everything, including everyone, do not actually exist. Everything is just a hallucination, except for you. You see, when you look at something, there is something there that causes it to be seen. Either it is real and that's what causes it to be seen, or it is a figment of your imagination, and that instead is why you see it. So when you think, there must be something that is thinking. But it isn't as though your thought is an illusion. If the world is not an illusion, then what you see before you is real. If it is an illusion, then what you see before you is not real. However, the same is not true of your thoughts. In a real world, your thoughts are real. And in an illusory world, as a brain in a jar, your thoughts are still real. So it isn't observation that makes the statement true. It is the reasoning I just outlined, because after all, an observation can be false. And so it is the reasoning we use to prove that we do not have to rely on the objectivity of our observations in order to conclude our own existence, not observation in its own right. Although here again, the question becomes where we got our ability to reason from, such to verify observation. I think we can argue that this would all have to go back to a first observation and a first interpretation. If we've accepted that observations can be flawed, then we've accepted that reason is necessary to verify them. Which means if we claim that observation came first, then we would have no ability to make sense of our first observation without reason existing prior. For this reason, we know that inference has to come first. And I mean, it's pretty much baked into the language of this debate that reason does come first and observation comes second. That's why you have these terms, I believe, originally introduced by Aristotle, although I doubt he introduced them by name because it's Latin, but it was later popularized by Immanuel Kant of a priori and a posteriori. In Latin, they literally mean from the prior and from the latter. For this reason, I think we can say that the rationalists are right and that the empiricists are wrong. If one thing has supremacy over the other, then reason has supremacy over experience. But again, that's if one thing has supremacy over the other. I would argue that both are equally important, and even more than that, the question of empiricism versus rationalism, as it is framed by academics, doesn't really speak to anything meaningful. Earlier, when I was walking through the possible criticisms and rebuttals each side could make in order to form my conclusion and help you reach your own, I was also highlighting the premise of this video. For any argument one side makes, the other side could make a completely reasonable rebuttal. A rationalist could say that reason is the source of all knowledge, and that we use reason to draw conclusions using evidence that can either be a priori or a posteriori, and an empiricist could use terms like reflective experience to subsume rationalist arguments and rebrand them as empirical. But in that, if the disagreement is in how knowledge is conceptualized, and not instead how it is such that they disagree on the nature of knowledge itself, then this is a pedantic argument and nothing more. And it doesn't actually address the real disagreements these groups tend to have, which is why I think that the argument of empiricism versus rationalism needs to be redefined. When we examine those on both extremes of this debate, we find that extreme empiricists are those who believe that everything can be proven through observation, and extreme rationalists are those who believe that everything can be proven through reason. This observation helps us to understand what really is in debate. Since truth is when a statement is in accordance with reality, we can say that true knowledge must be reflective or symbolic of reality. In this, the claim of the extreme rationalist makes no sense, because even though it is true that inference could make a structurally consistent world, it cannot give it the context of the world in which the thinker resides. Think of it like this. Imagine we were playing a game where I could go to a planet, and it could be any planet I wanted. If I tell you nothing about the planet, you have no way of knowing which of the possible planets in your imagination it could be. You could think of all the planets you know and even hypothetical ones you could imagine, but you don't know which one of those is the one that I am on. If now I tell you that I don't need any special equipment to survive on the surface of this planet, you know that I am on a planet with a breathable atmosphere. By virtue of that, you also know that unless the sun is intense and emits a different color of light than our own, it is highly likely that the sky on this planet is blue, as it is unlikely that I would be safe to breathe the air if it contained, for example, a high amount of iron oxide like on Mars, which turns that planet's sky red. There are probably a lot more things we could infer from this, but I think you get the point. You can't know what planet I am on until I give you observation-linked information, which means without observation, you cannot know what world I am on, and outside of this analogy, you cannot know if your statements are true, since you can only construct consistent hypothetical propositions, but you do not know if they are in accordance with reality. But obviously this goes the other way. Yes, you needed information linked to observation to make statements in accordance with reality, but this wasn't directly necessary for all things. You didn't need to observe or have information from observation that there was breathable oxygen, because this was logically implied by my ability to survive on the surface unaided. So I can understand the belief that experience has supremacy over observation, although again I would argue that it is impossible to meaningfully tokenize experience without reason existing prior. But the notion that some people have that everything can be proven through observation or through scientific experimentation is just as absurd as the extreme rationalist position, if not more so, because instead of just holding a position that contradicts the nature of truth like the fringe rationalist position, the extreme empiricist position also contradicts itself. Saying that reason alone is not sufficient to prove certain things violates the nature of truth, because it is, for all intents and purposes, the same as saying that a statement that mirrors a thing in reality, which has a relationship with another object by necessity of its nature, cannot be said to imply the mere statement of the other object. Not only is this necessarily false, like How, for example, we know that I could not have been on a planet without breathable air, because by the nature of how I function, I would have died, necessarily implying the nature of the air, but also because it would likewise undermine any predictive power one may claim science has. If you say that observations imply an unobserved truth, which must be true in order to predict a thing as opposed to verify it or state a pre-observed fact, then by definition of it being unobserved, you would have to concede that it is possible for a statement to predict another statement without direct observation, which means that we cannot reject reason's ability to prove and predict truths. And I know I probably seem like I'm rambling on, and it especially seems that way in retrospect, but I just want to walk you guys through this and work through it naturally rather than trying to just state it as a self-evident fact. So hopefully by now you will see these two extremes as not just what people typically define them as, the belief that everything can be proven empirically versus the belief that everything can be proven rationally. Hopefully you will see them as something less vague and more concrete. Reason can prove things, but only within so many degrees of observation. When you knew facts about the planet I was on, you could infer others. When you knew nothing, you could infer nothing. In this, the fault in the furthest you can take the rationalist position is that it is impossible to create any knowledge claims with zero observations. On the other side, empiricists failed because you need reason, at least in that it is the glue that holds observations together and gives them meaning. By virtue of these extremes establishing a clear spectrum, I think we can say more than just the vague notion of one idea having supremacy over the other, that the argument between rationalism and empiricism is the argument of how many observations are necessary to complete an epistemological framework, or in simpler terms, how many inferences are made per observation. I tend to think of this as the level or degree of thought. As we have already gone over, there are the two positions that cannot be expressed as proportions, where one of the two forms of knowledge is rejected. But these are more of a hypothetical because I don't think anyone would take them seriously. But instead, for example, you could have one observation to all truths, which could perhaps be the position that something like "I think, therefore I am" is enough to infer all other possible truths. Or more commonly in the real world, you could have the hardline empiricist mindset of one-to-one thinking. There are people who will ask for a source for every single knowledge claim, as though nothing can be inferred. Or likewise, they will ask you, "Where did you learn that from?" for anything you are able to reason out on your own. This is because they have, inarguably, a flawed level of thought. For the same reason we went through earlier with the rejection of all reason, one-to-one thinking is a rejection of a fundamental truth, as it implies everything must be observed. However, we know that this is not true. Even assuming a reductionist view of knowledge where nothing is greater than the sum of its parts, we know that the microscope, for example, was not invented by observing a microscope. The light bulb was not invented by observing a light bulb. There is no idea or invention that was ever made by virtue of direct observation alone. Obviously, the more intelligent empiricists try to remedy this by allowing for slightly higher levels of thought, accepting inferences closely tied to observation. But I think even with these attempts at resolving the flaws in their ideology, the truth still favors the rationalists, in so much as, even though I'm inclined to say that one observation is not enough to ground an epistemological system, I can't really think of any irrefutable arguments as to why that would be, other than maybe that the argument I used earlier as to how reason can be used to infer the existence of the self requires more observations. Like maybe certain laws of inference only exist in our universe, and as such, require us to learn them from our world. But even then, it's clear that lower levels of thought are more flawed, and I think understanding it in this way, we can see why. And that's why I think the discussion of rationalism versus empiricism needs to be redefined. Although I suppose I should say that it needs to be re-evaluated, because it's not as though the way in which many already conceptualize this argument is wrong. It's just that it places more of a focus on the very deep and, honestly, sometimes meaningless pedantic arguments, rather than focusing on the more tangible differences that people have, especially in modern discourse. So I'm suggesting this interpretation not as a replacement, but as an alternative. One that will make the conversation far more approachable and far more relatable to the average person. Especially once we consider that if we conceptualize it in this way, we can kind of make it into a learning aid, where we can characterize other aspects of thought as having directions. But all that being said, if you would be so kind as to subscribe and come back not next week, but the week after next, I think I'll save that for another video.